All right. Good morning, everyone. Hi, Camille. And so we're a bit late because one of us is, adventuring through the downtown Bogota to reach here. So you should be here anytime. But in order not to waste more time, we shall start with the panel for this morning, titled. Sorry, guys. Mobilization and the environment. So we have three panelists. Let me introduce them to you. So first is Dr. Olivia Arrigo-Stals, who's an interdisciplinary researcher of indigenous and peasant politics and the rural world in the 20th century Bolivia, and currently an Awesome Forum postdoctoral fellow in the Democracy and Development at the Universidad de los Andes. Can I have a shout out for Olivia because she just obtained a postdoc at Manchester a few days back, so we're all very glad. Congrats, Olivia. She was previously a lecturer in Latin American Studies at the University of Essex in the UK and a postdoctoral fellow in the Indigenous and Ecology and Environmental Crisis Research Cluster at the University College of London, and a research associate on rethinking values of the Anthropocene project at the University of Bristol, still in the UK. She holds an MA in Latin American Studies from UCL and a BA in History from the University of Oxford. Her doctoral project, We Are the Seed from Which Bolivia Was Born, Indigenous Politics and the Environmental Question in Highland Bolivia, 1920-1990, was awarded in 2022 from the Department of Sociology, University of Essex. Second on the panel, we have Dr. Claudia Leal, who's a full professor at the Department of History and Geography here at the Universidad de los Andes, and she holds a PhD in Geography from the University of California at Berkeley. She helped found and was the co-president of the Latin American and Caribbean Society for the Environmental History, SOLCHA, or SOLCA. She wrote Landscapes of Freedom, Building a Post-Emancipation Society in the Rainforest of Western Colombia, published by University of Arizona Press in 2018, and has edited several books. Among them, we have A Living Past Environmental Histories of Modern Latin America. She's finishing a history of Colombian national parks and is also researching the history of animals. And last but not least, we have another fellow here at OSUN, Youssef El Shazly, who's associate professor in political sociology at the University of Paris 8, Vincent Saint-Denis, where he also heads the Department of Social Sciences of the Mediterranean worlds. Youssef holds a dual PhD in political science from the University of Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne and Lausanne. Youssef's main research interest over the past decade and a half has been the study of contention in authoritarian context. He has more specifically studied the emergence and decline of the Arab uprisings, both at the individual level of participants and looking at the collective dynamics. More recently, Dr. El Shazly has shifted his interest towards issues of infrastructural project, authoritarian considerations, and ecological crisis. So without further ado, let's open up the panel. I believe, Olivia, you are the first. We will be talking for 20 minutes each for each participant, and I will give a very nasty sign when the time is about to expire. Okay. Olivia.
Thank you, Massimo. Right. So in the framework of mobilization, this presentation is going to focus on two distinct but connected processes in the unsettled late decades of 20th century Bolivia. So firstly, the rise of organized peasant indigenous movements, which oriented themselves around the dual concerns of economic exploitation and racialized oppression. And secondly, the expansion of the agrarian frontier in the Bolivian lowlands. So I make 2 points. One is rather obvious. Firstly, that peasant and indigenous movements and their mobilization was decisive in the shaping of democratic cultures in the late 20th century in Bolivia. But also that there are competing visions of democracy, including the role of the natural world within and between these indigenous and peasant movements. So in this, I build on Monica's paper that we heard yesterday. And secondly, my other point is that the new processes of agrarian extractivism in the late 20th century expose key cleavages in the highland and lowland indigenous and peasant movements in the 80s, and lie at the heart of 21st century unsettled land politics in Bolivia, which is a story that extends far beyond Bolivia, with landscapes being transformed for intensive agriculture globally. So I'm not a political scientist, and I am a historian working within the interdisciplinary environmental humanities. So I began this project a few years ago, but with this new postdoc, this will allow me to take it forward into a bigger book project. So just to kind of frame this and sort of explain a bit what brought me to thinking about agrarian colonization, which I'll explain more about shortly, is that the story of the highlands in the post-revolutionary era, so post-1952, which was the focus of my doctoral work, is just one side of the Bolivian revolution and agrarian reform. But its trajectory was very different in the lowlands. And this historical process is at the heart of today's deepening land conflicts. And secondly, I think agrarian colonization is a useful lens for thinking about peasant and indigenous movements as dynamic actors in Bolivia in the 20th century, as creators of knowledge and architects of new political struggle oriented around the ecological question. So, okay, to give a bit of background about what agrarian colonization is, so from the 1960s, colonization programs funded by USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, directed by regional and national governments in Bolivia, encouraged the migration of highland, Aymara and Quechua-speaking peasants to the sparsely populated lowlands. So the US had been interested in land settlement since Plan Bohan in 1941, which sort of recommended large-scale industrial agricultural developments in the lowlands. So scholarship on this process has largely been ethnographic or contemporary in focus, but the historical origins of these developments have attracted less attention. So as part of this project, I want to think more about how peasant and indigenous movements shaped the process of agrarian colonization bottom up. And I also want to reflect on why indigenous and peasant movements have taken divergent paths in the highlands and lowlands, which is an important factor in ongoing conflicts over land and indigenous rights today. So just kind of briefly on sources. So this is already I have completed some archival work in the Agrarian Reform Archive and in the APCOB Fondo. But the new postdoc that I will be undertaking will allow for some extensive fieldwork in the colonization sites, together with this organization, SIPCA, which has worked with peasant and indigenous groups for a very long time in Bolivia. So this is, using historical methods combined with oral history interviews. So to describe a bit the context in which peasant and indigenous movements operated, so really in the highlands, the peasant movement coalesced around the Sesutsabe. And this emerged in the 1970s as part of efforts to build an autonomous and independent peasant union movement. The previous sort of iterations of peasant movements had been heavily co-opted by the government under what's known as the Military Peasant Pact, which we can talk about later. So the Sesutsabe emerged out of what is called the Catarista movement, a radical Aymara indigenous movement which in the 70s and 80s contested the violent racialized oppression and exploitation of Bolivia's indigenous peoples. So the Sesutsabe claimed to represent all indigenous and peasant groups, but in practice it was dominated by the Aymaras and Quechuas of the highlands. So it was my doctoral argument that organizations like the Sesutsabe articulated a new politics of the environment, which centered highland indigenous cosmovisions and asserted the need for reciprocal relationships between human and nature, or the other than human. But if we turn to the lowlands, a very different situation emerges. So, in parallel with the Sesotho, and initially working closely, arose SIDOB in the 80s. So, in just a sort of a bit of background, by 1994, the indigenous populations of the Amazon and lowland region was estimated at 220,000 people. So, it's much smaller, much less sort of politically organized than the highlands. And the lowland territories have been peripheral historically in Bolivia, with minimal state presence until the mid-20th century. And in contrast with the highlands, neither colonial nor republican states penetrated the lowlands with much success. So unlike the highlands, where you have this very long history of organizing and this much tighter connection with colonial and then national power structures, lowlands indigenous groups were much smaller and much more dispersed in these vast territories. So SIDOB unsuccessfully proposed in the 80s the creation of an assembly that would have brought together SIDOB and the Sesotho Bay to create this kind of large umbrella organization, a bit like CONAI in Ecuador, but this was not successful. So just kind of also thinking about when we're talking about land and territory and democracy in Bolivia, I think we do need to dwell on the socio-spatial meanings attached to these concepts. So there is a vast body of anthropological literature on highland indigenous societies, which has documented the complex relations that exist between Andean peoples and their environments. So these are constituted through ritualized encounters with what Marisol de la Cadena calls earth beings. So Marisol de la Cadena argues that beyond the liberal notion of cultural differences, indigenous cosmovisions represent different worlds marked by partial connections with the non-indigenous world. So these connections open up spaces of meeting and solidarity with political worlds beyond the Ayu, or the socio-spatial unit of territory in highland places. So the historical conflict over agrarian reform in Peru and Bolivia is on the one hand a political conflict over land and resources readily understood in the Western political lexicon. However, it can also be said to conjure a more profound epistemic conflict over the precise meanings attached to land, territory, and the more than human entities that reside there. So as de la Cadena concludes, the appearance of earth beings in social protests may evince a moment of rupture of modern politics. In a similar vein, the Aymara historian Esteban Ticona argues that the historic conflict over land between highland indigenous societies and the Creole mestizo Spanish descendants hinged not only on land as a resource, but on the conception of territory embodied in the Ayu, including its human and non-human entities, such as sacred hills, the Uwiris, which connect the Ayu with the past and future. So I think we have to think here about expanding what we take to be a political actor and what we understand democracy as relating to. So who and what is accommodated in these visions of democracy. So that's a sort of something to mention. So, and a sort of a kind of third space or third actor, and something that is a bit of a grey area, I think, here are the organizations, the sindicatos, that emerged in the lowlands, in the colonization sites. So these new agrarian spaces from the 1970s. So these are highland indigenous organizations, peasant organizations, operating in new lowland places. So when these colonizadores, or the highland Aymara and Quechua-speaking farmers, arrived in the colonization sites, they formed sindicatos. And these were central to life in the settlement zones. And apart from the churches, really were the heart of communal life. So the National Institute of Colonization, the INC, which kind of oversaw, was the state presence overseeing this process, supported the formation of sindicatos. And it was actually a cornerstone of the colonization policy. So these colonizadores, the settlers, are now known as interculturales. And this is a discursive shift from this colonizer title. So in one colonization site, San Julian, In the 1980s, these communal organizations were grouped into 14 trade unions, which in turn formed the Federación de Colonizadores de San Julián. So the FECSJ was militant in its organizational culture and fiercely committed to independence from state cooptation. So it arose out of a contestation from peasants at grassroots subcentral level for an autonomous union federation structure and control within the institutions that oversaw the colonization process. So union activities had been prohibited under the dictatorship of Hugo Banzer in the 70s. So the San Julian peasants were unable to form a confederation until the late 70s. And it was in this dictatorship period that some sectors of the peasant movement were particularly radicalized and sought greater autonomy from the state. So the FECSJ was part of or formed links with the Sesutsebe, which is the main highland confederation. So my point here really is that peasants who moved to the lowlands formed unions similar in organizational model to the Sesutsebe, rather than the lowland indigenous organizations such as SIDOB. So their capacity to organize was much greater than lowland indigenous groups. And although they sometimes occupied the same geographic space as lowland indigenous groups, they inhabited the land and territory differently. So the purpose was to do small-scale agriculture to obtain access to the market. And this is a kind of key contrast with lowland groups. So rather than the Sesutsebe and Sidob's focus on ethnic identity as part of a resistance to exploitation as peasants, the sindicatos in the colonization sites were formed more out of the fractious interactions with the state and with the sort of the immediately difficult environment of this new tropical space. The hardships that accompanied the colonization process. Okay, so this just is a kind of to give you an idea about, this is one particular colonization site, San Julian, which today is extremely prosperous. It's kind of at the heart of the expansion of the agrarian frontier, but when it emerged, when it was kind of formed in the 60s, there was no water supply, there was rampant gastroenteritis, many settlers died. So it was a very, so difficult process. So this is to give you an idea about spatially what this looked like. Okay, so to offer some sort of conclusions and kind of thoughts. So most obviously, the 20th century saw the rise of new indigenous and peasant mobilization in Bolivia and the Andes more broadly, which would see the transformation of state and society. So at the same time, these decades also saw the emergence of new forms of agrarian extractivism, which rested on imaginaries of extraction and ecological predation. So agrarian colonization created these new ecologically destructive regimes tied to the expansion of the frontier, which incorporated indigenous and peasant peoples in new ways. And it was part of this developmentalist vision of progress in which peasant movements emerge as a complicated and dynamic actor, at times advancing, but also resisting state visions of extractive development. Sort of finally, that Bolivia's unsettled land politics and deepening agrarian extractive model is, of course, a major challenge for democracy and ways of relating to land and nature in the 21st century. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia. You actually did it in 15 minutes. You didn't even need a warning for the time. Now, Professor Claudia, the stage is yours. You're projecting also slides, or? Perfect. So I'll give you a warning at 10 minutes and then 5 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. Please. Good job. Oh, sorry. Sorry about this.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I'm not a political scientist either. I'm a geographer, historian, and as you heard, I work on national parks. And if we think of the history of national parks that I've been working on in Colombia, it starts in 1948. The first, it was the park, it was a reserve, but it was created in 1948. But if we think about Latin America, the first parks in Latin America were created in the early 30s. Not everywhere, but in countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. However, if we move a little bit forward, so these are, and they're important. They cover a large percent of the territory. In Colombia, it's close to 15% of the territory. And if you look at other Latin American countries, you see something similar. But when we look at the long history, something stands out. This is a graph of the number of protected areas created by year. And what stands out is that it really takes off in the 1970s. And this is for not for Colombia, but for all of Latin America. And if we move and see a similar graph for the world, we see something that is similar. It starts earlier. It goes way back, into the 19th century. You see an increase in the 1950s, the period that we call the beginning of the Great Acceleration, but it really takes off in the 1970s. So there's something big happening in the 1970s in Colombia, in Latin America, and in the world. Now, if we think about the way or what's going on in Latin America at that time, there are two things that I would like to highlight in relationship to the interests of this conversation that we're having here related to democracy and mobilization, is that parks in Latin America and in Colombia were not created out of a lobby of a strong environmental movement that was asking, pressuring the state for the establishment of protected areas. So it had a different origin. But the other thing is that, I don't know how many of you are experts in Latin America, but the 70s were a period of authoritarian rule in Latin America. All except 3 countries in Latin America had dictatorships in the context of the Cold War, Colombia being one of those exceptions. So the question here is, what's the relationship between parks and democracy? And this is a way of, showing you that there's something there that we need to explore. So I'm going to gloss over, really, be very schematic on 3 big points of how democracy, citizenship, and civil society, so the ways in which democracy in general relates to this history of protected areas in Colombia, but I think with wider relationships with with Latin America. So first is the question of how national parks were created and were established, or actually how national park systems, because what really happened in the 1970s, parks existed before and parks were created after the 70s. But what's really key about the 1970s, it was when a bunch of parks were created in most countries. And when you have a sizable amount or a high enough number of parks, what you have is not just individual parks, you have a national park system, something that is stronger, that is important as part of the state apparatus. So as I was saying before, what you have in Colombia is not a dictatorship as you had, in Argentina and in so many other places of Latin America, but Colombia was part of a broader political framework, which is what we call presidentialism. And in very broadly speaking, and if you're a political scientist, I'm the one who doesn't really know about this, is the president, the executive branch taking over the responsibilities of Congress, of the legislative branch, mainly creating laws by decree, taking the initiative of shaping laws and thus shaping policy in what's happening in the country. So I like very much this story, and historians, a mixture of historian and geographers. We like to tell stories. I'm going to tell a little story of how the national park system in Colombia came to be. So how this presidentialism in Colombia happened. And it starts with this person here, El Mono Hernandez, Jose Ignacio Hernandez, who was a naturalist working in the Environmental Institute in Colombia. And he drafted a map, actually another map different than this one, which had much more little black areas of all the key places that needed to be turned into national parks. And the head of the institute where he worked went to the National Planning Department with the map because he had been a student of the head of the National Planning Department. And so, he needed to do something as the head of this relatively novel environmental institution. And he goes and says, we've got this map and it would be nice, if we could create some national parks. And the head of the Planning Institute says, whoa, 60 national parks, like, what are you talking about? We've got to prioritize. He was an economist, a very well-known economist from this university, Miguel Urrutia. And Urrutia tells the head of the environmental agency, why don't we prioritize according to water supply? Because what's happening in the country and what's happening in Latin America at the time, population is growing really rapidly. People are moving to the cities are growing, and there's a big problem of water supply. And water supply, if you didn't learn this before you leave, you have to go to the páramos, which are the highland ecosystems where we get water from. They're like water sponges that where water gets stored and where most of Colombian cities get water from. So the economist who's not thinking about ecology, but it's thinking about planning and about public services says, okay, we can create parks, but prioritize. And why do you prioritize according to water? That is according to páramos. And with that new map, they go to the president, and the president says, yeah, this sounds very well. And so the president gathers all the ministers and tells, this is what we're thinking of doing. And the ministers say, whoa, that's very nice for, what we would call today the global north. But here in Latin America and in Colombia, we need to develop, and we can't put all those limits to development, because something else that is important, it's that the 1970s is not just a period where so many parks get created, but where there's a global understanding, a new shared global understanding of what national parks are. And it's the understanding that we have today, that these are places to protect ecosystems where no productive activities can be done. The previous parks that had been created in Latin America had been created with very different ideas in mind, including taking settlers to live in those places to nationalize those areas. But that's a long story that I'm not going to go into. So coming back to what's going on with the meeting of ministers, some ministers say, no, this is not a good idea, Mr. President. Mr. President listens to all of them and says, okay, very well, very nice. We've got other issues on the agenda. And 21 parks are created all at once with the priority of having water from the páramos, as you can see here. And so this is the map. All the parks in red are the ones created in the 1970s. Not all of them are the ones created in this moment. A few were created before. And the ones in green are the ones that had been created in the 1960s, and the one single one created in 1948. So what you're seeing here is that there's a president who's pretty much single-handedly taking this decision without consulting Congress, so no participation of political parties, but also no participation of what people would ask today. So they didn't go and talk to the people who lived in these places. Of course, they didn't go and talk to anybody. But they not only did not talk to indigenous and the peasants who lived there, they didn't talk to landowners. Not there, neither in 1977 when this happened, but neither in all the previous parks that had been created. And some of these were, important political people in the regions, and they were also glossed over, and the parks were created. So you could say a clear imposition, a case of authoritarianism. So the conclusion that we could take is, okay, so parks were created because of authoritarian or presidentialist regimes that shrink democracy. And sure enough, that is clearly the case. But I think that's only part of the story, because if we only focus on that, we're missing a big part of the story. And that other part of the story is, well, two parts of the story. One has to do with why the 1970s? Why is this happening everywhere, not only in Colombia? It's not just a matter of that particular president. This is happening in many different parts of the world. because of the rise of environmentalism, and the rise of environmentalism, not here, the rise of environmentalism in the, again, quote unquote, global north, that you can see by the creation of, or meetings like this one, that led that environmentalism to have an institutional grounding that could impact what was happening in places like Colombia. So here you have somebody that was sent by some of those multinational institutions to help the national, this is the same person, you know, he was way younger when he came, and he helped the, and he helped, yeah. So this was important. These were people who were traveling all around and saying, okay, this is what a national park should be, and this is what you should do. And this guy was helping somebody who later chaired or was the head of the national park system in Colombia. So all that is happening all around the world, and that is why this doesn't happen only in Colombia, but everywhere. So if we limit it to authoritarianism or to presidentialism, we're missing a big part of the explanation. It didn't really matter if you had an authoritarian regime or a non-authoritarian regime. This was going to happen no matter what. And the other important issue is the growth of the state, is the establishment of environmental institutions that were in charge of planning and managing national parks. So that guy that I showed before, the naturalist, he worked in Inderena. And if Inderena didn't exist, there wouldn't have been the plan, there wouldn't have been the map, and everything wouldn't have happened. So that's kind of my first point. Yes, presidentialism that limits democracy or shrinks democracy is important to understand the creation of national parks, but it's only a partial explanation. My second point has to do with citizenship, and so national parks have the potential of, again, enhancing citizenship, or let's say shrinking citizenship, limiting citizenship. And the most obvious way is, and what people talk about the most, is by people living inside national parks. So that takes us back to what we were talking before. So they establish these national parks, they create them in paper, but then you have to just go and build a park in the ground. And there were not enough resources. So many of these parks are so-called paper parks. They're created, but they're not built on the ground. So people are not evicted. People continue to live there. People continue to arrive and live there. Many of the people living in national parks arrived after the national parks were, created, but people didn't know. I mean, it didn't look like a national park. It was just like any other place. And that has a very strong effect on citizenship. So it's not the super strong effect of, people are evicted, their rights are so forcibly affected, although in some cases it did happen. For the most part, what happens is that people continue to live there because the state doesn't have the clout to evict them, but also because the state doesn't want to. It's very politically costly. And some of the people who are on the ground understand what's going on and don't want to evict people. In any case, that doesn't happen, but that doesn't mean that people are not affected. Because when you live inside of a national park, I'm going to show some picture of Tinigua National Park, created in 1989, which is a park that I love very much. And here you have an image. Oh, you can see it very well, but here's somebody living within the park. And there are other people living within Tinigua National Park, all of whom I know, all friends of mine because I live there. And these are people who can't have a school, who can't have a road. So, and these are, citizenship rights, part of what we call social citizenship, which is limited by the fact that you live in a national park, even though nobody is able to stop you from hunting, stop you from planting, corn or coca or expanding cattle ranching. So citizenship has been very strongly affected negatively of some of the most vulnerable populations in the country. Now, on the other hand, I'm going to skip that. On the other hand, citizenship can also be enhanced, and this has been done like so in the case of Colombia. And I'm going to bring an example from the people who took over the management of national parks in the 1980s. It used to be foresters, and it moved to anthropologists. And these were really fantastic people at the time, and they decided we need Colombians to appropriate the parks, to know that they exist, to love them. So they created a park of voluntary rangers. Some of the people of this university went there. Their target was like professionals, middle class, who would love nature, love parks, and later on help protect parks. And the other thing they did, and this is one of the few touristy parks that we have in Colombia, again, some place that you might want to go if you haven't gone to, Tayrona National Park in the Caribbean, with this, gorgeous, beautiful base. And the head of parks hired one of his friends who was an architect to create, these gorgeous cabins, that blend into the environment, so that people could go there and have a different kind of vacation. So this is important. It's not to make a lot of bucks by bringing, Europeans and gringos. It's to bring Colombians. It's to bring Colombians so that they become more Colombian by knowing their patrimony, by being there, by knowing it and loving it. And that, again, happens so. This happened only in a very few places. A little anecdote. I stayed there probably late 80s, early 90s with my parents. There was no water. We had to go all the way to to a restaurant in the road, pretty far away, to take a bath in a super hot place. So, it worked so. In most places, in most parks, they didn't have that. But also because, another anecdote, I wanted to take my students on a field trip this semester, and I called parks because they didn't know the Páramo. And I said, you can't be a Colombian and not know the Páramo. Let's go to a Páramo. Let's go to Sumapaz, the biggest, most gorgeous Páramo in the world, right in the south of Bogota. No, there's no visitation. We can't take, and so no visitation, which goes against this precise idea of people knowing and getting to know the places. So some efforts have been done. Like, I took this picture 2 weeks ago, that's in Carrera Tercera, just here, so Parque Los Nevados. When you get to the airport, you see some, those are part of those same efforts. But when I talk to my students, most don't know parks, haven't gone to parks, they've gone, this process of appropriating and enhancing citizenship of mostly middle class people hasn't happened. So the big point of this second point of citizenship is the limiting of citizenship hasn't been as strong as it could have been, but the enhancing of citizenship hasn't been as strong as it could have been either. And in the 2 minutes that I have, I'm going to try to finish with mobilization. And I have 3 points, so let's see if I can make them quickly. One, parks have fostered political mobilization and organization from people that have been affected by parks. And I'm going to bring one example from Tinigua that I showed was over there. This is the first national park that we have in 1948. And the border used to be the Rio Guejar that you see on the top. And all the red is colonization. So from the beginning in the 60s, the area started to be colonized, and that mobilized peasants against the park. And they had a very environmental argument. It's like, if you give us titles of our lands, if you shrink the park and give us titles, we'll stop more colonization from happening. And they were able to do it, and the park was actually cut. But that was possible because it was the 60s. In the 70s, with the new strong laws, that was not possible. So peasants have continued to mobilize to be able to gain rights over the lands that they occupy and that they work, without any success. The law has become very entrenched. But there are other aspects of social mobilization that are also very interesting. And it's how some peasants have very strongly adopted an environmental attitude and discourse and created peasant environmental organizations, like these people who are members of Ascalje in that same region of Tinigua, as a way of negotiating with the state. So this is mixed because it's strategic. We're not just people who help the guerrillas and who chop down the forest. No, that's not really who we are. We are the people who are defending the forest, who live here. And it's a mixture of an opportunity, of a way of having legitimacy and a possibility of talking with the state. But on the other hand, deeply felt. It's a mixture, and you'd have to see who, in what place, at what time, but it's a mixture of both things. So what I'm trying to say here is that national parks have created, in a way, helped social movement with environmental touches to it. And to end, something that I find very interesting, and it's not usually thought of, is that national parks, and this is a story that I cannot tell right now, but the very first national parks were absolutely key to the creation of the environmental agency. The environmental agency that later turned into the Ministry of the Environment. And the people who worked in national parks, and the people who worked in that agency, and the people who worked in the ministry, became environmentalists by working in the state. They were not environmentalists before. It was being there, being in charge of taking care of nature, that they became environmentalists. And this is my favorite example from somebody of this university. He's a fantastic person. He was the first Minister of the Environment, Manuel Rodriguez. He was chosen as the last head of the agency, first Minister of the Environment, precisely because he was not a strong environmentalist and they didn't want, those environmentalists that don't let anything happen. And he became Mr. Environment to this day, formed as an environmentalist. And then he left the ministry and continued to act in favor of environmental causes as part of civil society. And that's just one case among many. So just to end, I know I'm going over my time. What I wanted to say here is that the political debate around national parks tends to be really watered down to parks are the best, they help protect nature, and that's very important. We're in the Anthropocene, we're in a deep environmental crisis, and what would we do without magnificent parks? And on the other hand, parks are, a form of green displacement, of kicking people off the land, of, reducing citizenship. And what I've tried to show here is that the situation does not limit to that issue, and it's much more complex and much more interesting. Parks are, as some people have said, political landscapes, and worth studying, not only by historians and geographers, but also by political scientists. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Floor is yours, please. Please. Oh.
Okay, thank you. Apparently, I won't have my notes, so I was going to start by saying that this is not my area of expertise. I'm starting in that project, so without my notes, this is going to be even more helpful. So yeah. What I want to talk about today is this new project I've been starting to work on for the past, let's say, a couple of years. As of the teaching load and all the other stuff, it's working from afar, just looking at some of ideas. And basically the nexus, the general nexus of what I'm interested in is to see how the current regime in Egypt, so as you know, Egypt witnessed a revolutionary sequence in 2011 to 2013 that was followed by a coup and a new regime that took power from 2013 on, and which, although it was described by a lot of people as just the old regime coming back, it's clearly not the case when you look at it more seriously, and it's a regime that has tried to present itself as in a rupture with the regime of Mubarak that had been in power between 1981 and 2011. And one of the main things that this regime has been pushing forward is this idea of the creating a new republic, creating a new state, and owning and pushing forward a very developmentalistic discourse that goes principally around mega projects, and this idea that mega projects are going to be the way to move the country forward. This has been very prominent in the discourse of the state, and my interest was to try to look at how these mega projects are contributing or not to forms of consolidation of the new regime, but also maybe what types of interaction might have with the ecological consequences that these types of mega projects might have. Initially, I'm a qualitative researcher. I do political sociology, political science, and the very initial interest was that anyone who was going to Egypt in these years was seeing a lot of changes happening, a lot of bridges, a lot of roads being built. I'm sure you've seen them in Cairo when you were there. So some of these projects were being talked a lot about, and initially I had just the interest to see what were the consequences. So just here as an example, this is a picture I took in a village in the Delta, in the Egyptian Delta, around between Cairo and Alexandria, 2 hours from both. And you could see in it one of this main project that the state was talking a lot about, which is a broad project for all the country to reline the irrigation canals and rivers. So you know that Egypt is a country that's more or less 1 million square kilometers, but as we Egyptians like to be close to each other, we live on like 5% of the country. Basically, close to the Nile Valley and the Delta. And all of that area is really, it's a maze of small irrigation channels and so on. And since water is a huge issue in Egypt, there was, for different reasons I can get into later on, this project that to say that these channels lose a lot of water every year, so we're going to line them. And this is an example of these lining projects that were done on, so it was said by, this is a quote from a pro-regime newspaper, largest project of its kind in the world in the modern era. This is, the pharaonic adjective comes from somewhere. It's always like the biggest. So it's basically the project was lining 20,000 kilometers of irrigation channels and rivers. But in the meantime, as one of the main human rights organizations had showed, that in that process, there was a uprooting of thousands of trees, and Egypt has the lowest per capita rate of trees in all of North Africa. And some of these trees had been like 100-year-old trees, all around, and they were all cut. So you can see how here they weren't cut, they're not right on the channel, but all of these areas, they cut to have something clean, with cement that, that is nice and doesn't waste any water. So this led me to start thinking more broadly, or maybe more to be more accurate, stumbled upon some forms of data, which was that to showcase all the work that the regime was doing, someone created, we haven't been able to go to know exactly, but a website was created that just showcased all the projects that the state was doing. And moreover, they were showcasing the project. So you have each project, it was geolocalized with Google Maps. Sometimes you would always generally have a web, a source from a newspaper saying how much it cost, stuff like that. And you have like the person who did it, which is the president every time. And we had 7,000, almost 7,500 projects in that. So, but with a very broad definition of what a project is, because you can find in it a nuclear plant, and you can find like just repainting a mosque in a village. All of that, these are state projects. So with Neil here, we worked on trying to get this data, try to work on it. And for now, this is still an ongoing project. We haven't done much with it, but this was the basis of starting to think about all that, where the projects are, in which areas, and so on and so forth. This is also the thing that I was mentioning in the beginning, that in the discourse of the state and in the discourse of the allies of the state, this importance of the development project and all that is very prominent. It's something central. It's almost a master narrative for the state. So here you have two examples. You have on the left is. So I had in my notes the reference, exact reference. So this was an 8 year after the election of the president, a booklet showing all the projects. And we speak a lot in Egypt of achievements in Gazette. A colleague, Shahab al-Khashab, is finishing a book about the politics of achievement in Egypt and how like this is the central trope. And on the left was a pro-regime magazine who was doing a special issue on, so it's written, the New Republic, and here it's New Republic and the achievements of the Egyptian state. And the aesthetics show you directly what is the vibe, right? It's trains and roads and buildings and phallic objects and that sort of stuff. So this is kind of the vibe that you get. And I had that interest to try to see what we can know a bit more about how the state is thinking and envisioning basically these projects and their effects basically on society. But another thing happened is that Egypt hosted COP27 in 2022. And by all measures, the Egyptian state, and Egypt wasn't generally a state that spoke a lot about the environment. This wasn't like the issue of climate change, for instance, was not a central issue for the Egyptian state, but it seemed, at least qualitatively, at least anecdotally, to become a central trope around that time. Also because Egypt has a very strong and extremely competent diplomatic corps that was very invested in doing a lot of work around the preparation of the COP, and also positioning itself as a champion of the African countries for all the debate on loss and damages, for instance, and so on, and as being a voice of the South. So it became suddenly the green themes or environmental themes became very prominent, which was a bit new and odd to note, at least. I know that there was a lot of comments in that slide, but that's nothing. So I want to give another image here of the framing. So this is a PowerPoint presentation by the focal point, the Egyptian focal point for the UNFCCC, basically UN Conference on Climate Change. And for me, it's very telling because it shows also this framework that exists in the state on how the environment is perceived. This is the person that is the focal point to talk about climate change. And in a presentation, we can see basically the reliance on mega projects and the very kind of centralized planning of agriculture, reclaiming desert lands and so on, that we've known have a tendency of having multiple effects and not necessarily the ones that you want initially. So you see these are different slides that show again the development ambitions in Egypt that go through these magnificent infrastructure projects, roads, and so on. And it's for me, it's still just very anecdotally strange to see a discussion on climate change, a PowerPoint that's supposed to be on the climate change strategy of Egypt, and have all these slides about Egypt unveiling a plan to build glitzy new capital. But you have some greenery down. So this was a reminder for me of the very good book by Gökçe Günel, a former colleague, on Masdar city in the Emirates, about these states that have these projects, these green projects, smart city projects, and then looking at how they actually end up working on the ground and all the effects that they might have. So, yeah, this is the final image of that PowerPoint, which is interesting. So, it's in the minds of people. It doesn't exist. But it's interesting image. Just very anecdotally, I was once speaking with someone who did that sort of simulations, and I was asking because it was a desert city, and I was like, I see a lot of trees in the model, and I was like, how do you get the trees? And he was like, it's in the program, you can add trees. And I was like, this is not how trees work. But anyway, yeah, it's not wrong. No, it's an engineer response to my question. I was like, it's in the program. So so another thing that now I'll speak a bit more to what I've been doing. It's basically the paper I'm trying to write these days. Is that I stumbled on another set of data that I'll talk about in a minute, and I was trying to look at basically what in the literature we find on how state agents think about, talk about the climate, the environment in a very broad sense. So in some of the papers I found, so some were on the construction of the Amazon problem in Brazil, some on the UK for the climate bill and so on. So you see that a lot of the politicians will have a very scientific discourse, a very technical discourse, focus on the technological solutions as the way out, which is something that Gökçe Günel has written about a lot, and economic framings, obviously, and very little will be said about the environment itself or non-human species, people, social factors, so a very specific type of framing. And in another paper, for instance, that was on Jordan, the focus for Global South countries on the costs of the transition and how the Global North needs to be, pitching in to help this transition. So, one thing is that the current president, compared to the former President Mubarak, speaks a lot. He's a president that gives lots of speeches and makes lots of comments that are usually filmed and you can find on YouTube afterwards. So this was an initial thing. So maybe this, even like a year and a half ago, I was like, okay, I might try to look at this qualitatively. So try to find some, get some of the speeches and transcribe them, see how, even in a very kind of critical discourse analysis, what is he saying, how is he talking about that subject. But one of the independent medias in Egypt called Al Manassa has given itself one of its roles. One of the things it does is that it publishes the exact transcripts of everything the president says. And they do that a bit. It's then to clean it is not that easy because they put, even if it's like saying they put so they put every little thing in the discourse, but obviously it gives a very useful source because it's full transcripts. So thanks to my new best friend ChatGPT, I was able to scrap all the contents and like have it in a data set organized. First, before it was Neil who would help me for that, but once he told me, he saw me ask ChatGPT, and now I have a new best friend. And yeah, and other thing that actually might be of interest, and it's something that we're looking at with Neil, is that the presidency also puts online the transcripts, but not for everything, just the official, and it's the official script. So we have two data sets. One with more or less 845 actual things the president said. So that might be just a comment with the press, talking at an inauguration, or a very formal event at the UN, for instance. And then you have the official one, which has 305. And these are official transcripts in classical Arabic and not in Egyptian. So there are some comparisons to make. So now I'm going to just put a bunch of slides, a bunch of graphs, because this is the new thing I do when I have insomnia. So I tried to look, this is again, with ChatGPT, I'm not at all literate with quantitative stuff, so this has been very helpful to have tools like ChatGPT now for that. Basically try to extract what would be environmental topics in this corpus, so the Manassa corpus, the corpus with the 800 plus ones. So I kind of thought about some categories that could relate to the environment in a very broad sense, not just like the issue of climate change. So for instance, climate change, the discussions around water, agricultural land, urban niche would be all about like parks and beautification and so on. Issues of pollution waste, which is a big thing in Egypt usually, renewable energy, and the issues of sustainability and development. So here it gives you a bit of an idea of, clearly water is a very central topic because it's a topic that's it's far beyond in the context of Egypt. It's a very conflictual topic. But what's interesting is to see that, well, very obviously there is a peak in 2022. The topic of climate change, the topics of the environment aren't that central before, but you have, so climate change I think is the clearest one. Yeah, climate change is the clearest one since you have just an explosion in 2022 around the organization of the COP and around renewable energies, pollution waste. Most of them, almost all of them have a peak on 2022. So, I mean, this seemed obvious qualitatively, but then it here becomes much clearer. Okay, here's the same showing the peaks. I'll keep going for these ones. So just to talk in the last 5 minutes about some of the very preliminary results that are kind of coming out of all that is some things are obvious in kind of the very early analysis. So first of all, it's something that already my colleague Marie Van Itzel had seen in a qualitative analysis of a couple of speeches where she was showing that the president uses what she terms a pedagogy of al-basit. Basit is the simple man, or the layman, and she shows how the president will always have this tendency in his speeches, especially when he's not like at the UN or something like that, to explain the problems in very simple terms for the normal Egyptian, like the average Egyptian citizen, and this is something that is very visible in a very simple thing. For instance, if you do a word cloud, so basically the biggest word that appear are I, we, which is not, you wouldn't have if you do it the same on like the official corpus, you won't get it because it's in classical Arabic. And here you have this very, because obviously I am doing this for you, we need to do this, which is, if you look at any Mubarak speech, it was a very different type of tone you would find. So in the two, this one was on all the corpus in any case, and the other was just on an environment sample, and you have the I and we and yani on the which is very kind of oral and very informal way of speaking. The other thing is the personalization of power. So for instance, the president always have this tendency to talk to people during, so in that picture I showed, he does that a lot. There's a conference, he's sitting, everyone is behind him, and he makes comments. And in his comments, he'll say, okay, General, I don't know who, where are we on that bridge? And the general will be like, oh, the bridge will take 3 months. Do it in 1 month. But he does that thing, or say, did you call, I told you to call that like the head of the Egyptian bank, and it's like, yes, I called him, Mr. President, and it will be solved. So this issue that there is a very, this personalization is also visible. I mean, you see it in other words. I won't get too much in it, but you have, for instance, the word muhandis, or that show 2 titles when speaking to people. Other thing is obsession with numbers. It's the president who actually is pretty good with numbers and always quoting figures and numbers all the time, and also highlighting this, what I call the politics of hyper efficiency, such as the example I just said. So here in that quote, the president was saying that the way that we have to do studies before doing a project makes us take 5 years, and we don't have 5 years. With my way, we'll make 100 projects in 1 year, even if there are a couple of projects that are not good because we didn't do the study, the impact study and so on. So this is a very visible calling on someone in the assembly and saying, you need to do it faster. It's 2 years, no, do it in 1 year and so on. So this is a very much visible aspect. And again, as an example of the obsession of numbers, you have this, while speaking on state projects, so always like numbering the number of bridges, of roads, of kilometers of roads, of money that was invested and so on. Yeah, okay, I'm gonna stop because I'm gonna stop here because, but again, this is, I was saying, I'm happy to have feedback since this is something that is really, really starting. And this is like the speech project, let's call it, is a sub project and the larger one on the mega project, and that I'll try to. My aim is to try to maybe do a paper for environmental politics based on that, you know, that paper, basically. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there.
So, all right, we have would say 10, 15 minutes before the coffee. Even more than that. Okay. We lost like forever. All right, so I'll open the conversation to the audience here. Who wants to ask first question? Francesco. Okay.
Sorry, I have a question for Olivia on the 2 unions that you mentioned, because you mentioned CSUTCB in the highlands and CDOB in the lowlands, and you said that they were quite different because they couldn't merge at some stage, or they wanted to create an umbrella organization and they didn't succeed. I was wondering if you could expand maybe and explain why the 2 are so different, and how they operate differently then, and if they're in conflict, although they're supposed to be both kind of indigenous unions or syndicates. My question for Claudia is, there it is. I got your point that we cannot only look at the political regime to determine whether parks are created or not, that there's other influences. I was wondering, why did Colombia comply in the 1970s to this kind of international norms coming from the UN? there must be some reasons why they wanted to comply. I guess it was not, and given it was not necessarily, there was not necessarily a push from within to create the parks. So why comply to this? And for Youssef, my question is on the sub project, the one on the speeches, the speeches that he gives, and the comments that he makes on all sorts of things. What are you trying to explain with that? Like, are you trying to explain the difference between him and, so between his regime and the previous one, to counter those who say, well, you know, things have gone back to the way they were, but in fact, your contention is that they did not go back to the way they were. This is a substantially different regime. Or is there another question about, which I found interesting, the personalization of politics, that this is one of the ways in which you can demonstrate in Egypt, but then also elsewhere, that there is a kind of degree of personalization of politics that is going on. So I was wondering about, you know, the kind of direction that you want to give to the sub project.
We're going to collect 2 or 3 rounds. Yes.
No? Okay. Thank you very much for 3 interesting. Did you want? No, okay. Thank you for 3 really interesting presentations. Youssef, on yours, I was just thinking when you were wrapping up now, whether it would be useful to connect or explore some of the literature that's looked at the taming of nature, especially in Europe in the 19th century. And that went hand in hand with a lot of the international cooperation and the birth of a lot of international institutions. Because I think one element that's interesting that maybe isn't coming out as strongly yet, but you see it in your data, obviously, is the kind of international discourse around the environment, how what he's doing is framing in those terms, but that's not actually what's happening in reality. There's work by Joanne Yao. She's at Queen Mary University. She wrote a great book called Ideal Rivers that takes a sort of historical sociology take on rivers and how rivers have been tamed. That's super interesting in that regard. But I think what's interesting with it is that you have the link of industrialization, basically. And that's kind of the whole discourse around our vision of a society and the modernization and all of that. I think that'd be quite interesting to link to that. And coming out of that similar literature, I just wanted to make a link to Olivia and Claudia's work in that world of historical sociology and also IR, international relations. There's a lot of discussion around personality of nature, right? So I can't remember where, but there's a river that managed to get international recognition as being a persona. Yeah. Wait. Is it Trato? And so I was just wondering, it's not a direct question, but reflecting on both of your presentations about that issue, about the personality of nature itself and what it can do, how productive it is, what it can say. And Claudia, I just had a quick question on your graph. When you see how the number of parks, really, it's very obvious that the 70s is a very productive moment. The complete drop in the 90s and why that is, what happens. Is it linked to your story as well around the pushback and that sort of thing? Super interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentations. I have a comment for Olivia and 2 questions for Claudia. So I love the wealth of sources that you showed in your presentation. It will be a delight to spend time just going through all those little brochures that you got. But I also noticed that you mentioned USAID and the role that it played. So this is not a comment, this is not a question, it's a comment. Through my book, I learned that through the Land Tenure Center at UW-Madison, USAID sponsored rural reforms across the Americas. So I see how you're focused on super local archives, but if you're ever interested in coming to UW-Madison and do archival work at the Land Tenure Center, I will be more than happy to help you navigate that bureaucracy. Claudia, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to hear more about how you explain this I mean, we know that the state is a plural entity, and it wasn't just thinking about national parks, but at the same time, it was also pushing for colonization efforts. So if you could tell us a little bit more about how public officials in all these high-ranking positions grappling with this dual role that the state was playing, particularly during the 70s. We appreciate that. And for you, I don't know how many hours you sleep, but the amount of crafts that you show us, it's completely insane. You have a lot to play with. I mean, for me, it is, you show us very clearly that conversations at the global level impacted how at least policies talked about in Egypt. And I'm going to ask a very US question, and it's, so what? So now we know. So what are you planning to do with that? And what are the implications of realizing the role that the global is playing in shaping environmental policies and development policies in Egypt? Thank you.
So shall we have the first three and then we go? So we have Jamie booked and also Camille, correct? So you're number 4 and 5 on the list. Okay. So who wants to go first? Olivia, perhaps? Yeah, let's go with the presentations order, please.
Great, thank you. Yes, okay, so why are the Sesutsube and Sidob different? I guess the Sesutsube really it can be considered a sort of peasants indigenous movement hybrid structure. So operating within the parameters of organized labor, but rooted in localities with kind of indigenous modes of organizing in local areas. But I think the connection to organized labor is particularly important in thinking about the kinds of political projects it was pursuing. I mean, in 1980 there was a coup, and this was the first time that the leader of the peasant union kind of took over the COB, which is the main trade union confederation in Bolivia, extremely powerful, dominated by the miners. But the kind of affiliated, like the sindicatos who were sort of affiliated or at least kind of incorporated to some degree in the Sesutsupe's model of organizing, were also kind of committed to a politics of organized labor, and I would argue, and of particularly of state transformation. And in the 1980s, this takes the form of the plurinational project. And so you can kind of see this connection, a genealogy with sort of 21st century Bolivia, the MAS, the movement towards socialism, and Evo Morales. That kind of comes out of this organizing from the Sesutsube from below in the 80s. And that's very different from Sidob, which isn't really... which does use the language of peasants and kind of mobilizes as peasants, also as indigenous groups, but emerging out of a different context of territorial kind of incursions by loggers in Amazania and in the lowland territories, where there was no prior history of sort of organizing at kind of syndical level in the way that you see in the highlands. And the other thing is Sidob is heavily supported by APCOB, a group of anthropologists. And it sort of represents particularly the Guarani, but also kind of smaller indigenous groups, which are much smaller, more dispersed than in the highlands, and kind of are oriented around this question of resisting sort of logging, which really kind of starts to pick up in the 80s, and actually is connected to the kind of creation of particularly in one case forestry reserves, which allow logging. Anyway, it's kind of a different story, but that sort of connects with Claudia's kind of paper a bit. Anyway, so that is why they are two very different. So their rise out of different. Are constituted differently and respond to different historical concerns in these two regions. And I guess I'm trying here to sort of think about how the Sesutsube shows up in the lowlands. It's committed, it supports the process of agrarian colonization because it's supporting peasants in the highlands moving to the lowlands. So there you see a kind of conflict starting to be baked in between this highland developmentalist vision of the politics of nature that then starts to conflict with kind of how lowland groups are trying to resist. So that's kind of how I'd say they're different. And then on the question of the personality of nature and the personality of rivers. Yeah, so I would say that already within the peasant union, indigenous movement of the highlands and the lowlands is a recognition of nature as an actor, and particularly thinking about mountains as actors in the highlands. They're incorporated into political processes in kind of at local level. The Sesotho operates. This is kind of part of sort of indigenous cosmovisions. It shows up already. But on that question about sort of recognition, this is now something that has just started to be talked about in the case of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, which is under threat from a lot of pollution. So I was doing a project there a year ago, and there's now quite a big move to sort of try and get recognition of Lake Titicaca as a sort of an entity in the same way in New Zealand with I think the mountain there and the river in Colombia. So I think this sort of is a transnational sort of or there's certainly kind of transnational interest in that. Yes. Oh, and yes, and the USA point. Yeah, thank you so much. That's brilliant. Because actually, agrarian colonization is certainly not specific to Bolivia, and these projects were done all over Latin America. And I have not looked at the USA. A lot of the reports are in Bolivia, but I think there's probably a huge amount in the US actually on this. Yeah, thank you.
So thanks. So why did Colombia comply? And I think it's part of what I said, but I would need to spell it out more clearly. And there are structural reasons, and there are more like particularities for each country. And the structural reason that I think the two big structural reasons are the ones that I pointed out before, and it's the creation of what I like to call the nature state. So it's environmental institutions that are not just in charge of using nature for development, but in charge of what we could call taking care of nature. And that they're usually conflated, so it's not that easy. But these are happening across the board. And so once you have an institution and the mandate of that institution, it's partly to create and manage parks where you have a very strong force to comply. And that force grows much stronger when you have these guys coming all around the, because I mean, if you think about that institution, it's a very small institution with a bunch of very young guys, in the case of Colombia, foresters who are trained to chop the forest. And they receive these visitors from the UK, from the National Park Service of the US, and very largely from FAO. This guy, Kenton Miller, went all around Latin America, but he wasn't the only one. They were all very young guys. Kenton Miller had just finished his dissertation, I think, in Venezuela, and he was working in Costa Rica. So these are all very young men from Latin America and from abroad. Well, some of the British ones had a lot of experience in Europe, and they were in Africa, and they were not so young. But you have this very manly thing of this is the way you do it, and this is important. And the Eliodoro Sanchez, the guy that I showed that was the head of the national park system, he was taken on a 2-month tour of national parks in the US, and he calls it his national parks PhD. So, and that, I think we have to understand that it's very personal relationships and very strong. Something that I have a hard time really understanding is this initial foresters became super strong environmentalists and the most extreme environmentalists. They didn't want anybody in the parks, not even biologists. I don't quite understand how they got to be, such strong environmentalists, but they adopted it all. And that was that ethos was very strong in national park services across many countries and very strong in Colombia. It withered down with violence, with people having to walk out of parks because of our armed conflict. So that's like the big answer. But I think if you look into each particular case, because it was not, you could ask that same question for all the countries, you will see very particular stories of what happened. And so it has to do with the particular president saying, oh, yes, I've been to parks in the States, and I think they're very important. And sure enough, I'll make it part of my mandate to help promote parks. And tons of stories, of that sort. The fact that we had that genius that was El Mono Hernandez, who had not gone to college and who had since being an adolescent and a teenager, he started working or visiting the Institute of Sciences of the National University and rose to a very prominent position. And he was revered by everyone, and everybody wanted to do what he suggested, and he had a lot of ascendancy on the people who chaired or who run the Environmental Institute. So each country has a different story, but I guess it's the structural ones that are more important. What happened in the 90s? So there was this strong push in the 70s. In the 80s, and this was something that I couldn't say. There was a second push for a different reason. This was the moment where conservation biology came into existence around the concept of biodiversity. And so there was a strong push for creating national parks in rainforests. And that's why the most of the parks in the 80s and most of the parks in the 80s were in the Amazon, and most of the parks in the Amazon were created in the 80s. And there were these huge parks. So you would think, with our ideas of national parks today, that that's where national parks would have started. No, that was pretty much the end of it, associated with this particular moment of, we're chopping down the forest. This is going to be the end, and and these are the most valuable and diverse environments. So it wasn't we need the water for the urban population. Is we need to protect this new way of understanding nature, which is biodiversity. So there was some places started early on, 30s, 40s, 50s. Then the 60s picked up pace very strongly in the 70s, very strongly in the 80s. And then we had a lot of parks. And most of the parks were not managed. They didn't have anybody in them. And very important is that the rationale, why so many parks were created in the 70s, the one reason that I did not explain is because there was a shared rationale that helped that homogeneity. And that rationale was ecological representation. So we needed representation of every kind of ecosystem. So if we have this particular kind of forest, there has to be a little park or a big park, so that we have, like in the zoo, you have every kind of animal, so you have every kind of ecosystem that is protected in situ. But most of that was already in place by the 90s. So that's part of the story. The rest of the story is it's the turn to democracy. And the turn to democracy is new rules of the game. So we have the 1991 Constitution in Colombia, and there, changes all over the place, with a lot of new mechanisms that make it very hard to create a national park. If you're going to go and talk to everyone, so should we have a national park here? Nobody's going to want a national park. So, but there were much less initiatives of creating national parks in the 90s, and many of them that did not go through. Because we already had a national park. Why do we want to create a new park if we are not protecting the parks that already existed? So that mixture of, we already had the parks, we better focus on building and protecting those, and new democratic rules that made it really hard. And not only democratic rules, I think the territorial building of the state had expanded, creating other forms of territorial units that made it very hard to find a place where there was not already a reserve or some kind where you could actually create a park. It was much easier in the 60s and the 70s than it was in the 90s. Regarding colonization and national parks, of course, the 60s is what Olivia was saying. We have the Agrarian Institute, and the Agrarian Institute. One of the second most important strategy for agrarian reform was sending peasants to the jungle rather than redistributing land here in the Andes. And where did they land? They landed exactly where some of the parks, or at least this one park, was being created, and where other parks were going to be created later on. So there was clearly a clash. And initially, there wasn't, in the 60s, when Macarena was created, there was no environmental institute. The environmental institute was created in 68, and it wasn't so environmental. It was more about development of national resources earlier on. So which was the really strong institution? It was INCORA. And INCORA was in charge of creating national parks. So it's exactly what you're saying. So who am I, INCORA? Am I a colonization, or am I a conservation? And sometimes it really clashed, like in Macarena. In Macarena, they were creating, the garrisons is not the way, like posts where rangers would be, and they would try to stop settlers from coming in. And the only thing that this I mean, imagine 2 rangers here, 2 rangers there, and thousands of people coming in. All they could do really was take censuses. And so we know in this year there were X amount of settlers. 2 years later, there were more settlers. 3 years later, there were more settlers. They couldn't stop anybody. So it was the same in Cora initially that was counting who was getting into the reserve and not being able to do much about it. But in Tayrona, for example, it was the Incora who provided the money to buy out the settlers. So they didn't pay for the land because the settlers didn't own the land. They only paid for the mejoras. They only paid for the crops and the changes that they had done and kicked them off. And some were happy, some were not. I guess I always come to the same conclusion. Sometimes they helped and collaborated, and sometimes these two mandates clashed. Later on, those mandates split, and then the last thing about the granting rights to nature, I have to still try to wrap my head around it. I find it very difficult to understand. Some things might be easier, like the bear X, I forget the name of the bear, who was, granted rights. And it, in this particular case, are the rights of not living in a zoo, but, living like a bear. But it's not very easy because many zoo bears cannot live like bears. They are zoo bears. And so that little example is to show how difficult it is once you create that right to do something actually with the right. And the bear is the easy case. Then you go to the Atrato River, it's this huge basin. And so why was it created? It was created because the Atrato is contaminated with mercury because of gold extraction. And so it was like another layer, another legal layer to fighting this kind of problems, but with the same like real possibilities. So you have another paper layer if you wish, but it doesn't necessarily become very clear. And that's just one. There are other rivers. The entire Amazonian region of Colombia is a judicial persona. What do you do with that? What do you do with that? An entire jungle full of people and cities and cows and whatnot. So I'm very confused about this step.
Okay, so thanks, Sophie, for the reference. I'll definitely look into these, and I'll try to maybe respond to Francesco and Diana in the same effort to respond. Maybe it's to explain a bit where this research comes from, because I think it explains how I got there. This initially is a report that was financed by the Arab Council for Social Sciences, where I was contacted to basically write something about violence in Egypt. So usually you would have picked, the type of stuff I work on and like political violence and so on. But I chose for this paper to write on epistemic violence. So the idea was to see how the way that the environment is being framed in the Egyptian context had effects on, different ecological dimensions, such as biodiversity or whatever. So this was the initial aspect, and with the help of a research assistant and with Neil, then we were able to create the data set of the projects. So initially, this was really to try to look how does the way that the state broadly, not only, so I was looking at reports, I was looking at communiques by the Ministry of Environment, by economists and so on, how all of them, by thinking about the environment in certain terms, were affecting, constructing nature, constructing forms of environment, and transforming it effectively, and in the process transforming social relations that were around. So for instance, when I was going to see farmers next to these canals, the idea is to see how it affected them, how this change, and in the end it ended up being a dead end, because all the farmers wanted to talk to me about was the strawberry culture. So I ended up doing another small research on strawberry culture. But this is fieldwork. This is how it happens. So initially, this was the idea, and this is the initial way when we tried to look at the speeches. Was that we were thinking? This was in what we were doing with Neil, is trying to think in the fit or like the mismatch that might exist between what the government says that it's doing and where the projects actually go. this was one of the initial ideas that we had, and this is how I got a bit more into the speeches. But initially, it was just like looking at specific speeches very qualitatively to see, for instance, if you're saying, "Oh, we're building this and we're doing that," and then seeing if in the actual projects there is a mismatch or more project in that area or more projects where people voted for a certain political movements and so on and so forth. So in what I'm looking at now, I think there are two ways of looking at it. The first one is looking at the content. Looking at the content is almost in a very descriptive way, seeing how the head of the state speaks about the environment and thus construct the opportunities, constraints, obstacles that exist around that theme, how they use it to leverage political support or financial support. And this would be clearly a very kind of very straightforward descriptive piece, just saying and entering in the debate of the nascent environmental movement in Egypt. So it's more in that sense. But as you mentioned, and as I've started to see, is also it can be used to talk about other things, as the regime, for instance, how it works, how it functions, how it decides to take on public policy and so on. So one of the initial things we were thinking about with Neil, for instance, was to try to compare the official transcripts and the real transcript for the same speech and see when does the president improvise, because these are improvisation. It just starts, it goes off script and speaks because something has happened the day before or there's an issue. So to see when does he improvise, in what context, to say what, and so on. So these are the things that are next to the content, but might be then interesting about personalization of politics, how it functions, what type of, this was, the idea we had is, we think of, for instance, authoritarian leaders as, being unconstrained and having lots of freedoms, and looking at when they improvise, for instance, might tell us about the institutional setting that constrained them specifically. So this is for the so what question is at this stage is very exploratory, but I think the idea is to, for instance, with Marie Van Itzel, maybe thinking she has worked a lot on the reform of subsidy, of subsidy provision. So for instance, comparing how the presidency speaks about the logic of reform of this subsidy or the urgency of this reform compared to other public policy topics and so on, and see if that can descriptively open up to further research, and maybe then for me would be a next stage will also be more qualitative stuff with interviews in Cairo and etc. So this is why I'm saying it's very exploratory at this point. Some of the graphs are from last night and this morning, because I'm still going through, also discovering the literature and seeing what can be done methodologically to open up new avenues for research. So.
We're running a little bit short of time, so maybe I ask Jamie and Camille to be relatively quick, and you guys also in your answers. So yeah, yes. Jamie. No, I know you can. It's for the everything is going to be transcribed
for the recordings. Okay, great. So very quickly, awesome presentation. Thank you so much. Olivia, maybe this is an unfair question, but after Monica's presentation, your presentation, I'm really intrigued by this idea of cosmovisions and their compatibility with democracy or not. And so theoretically, I want to ask, according to the communities that you study, what would a better accommodation of nature or integration of the natural world within a democratic system look like? So what are we missing when we take standardized measures of democracy? Like what's left out of the conversation that they would argue need to be included? And sorry, I don't know this literature a lot, so maybe this is an obvious answer or not. Yusuf, I'm really interested both in terms of like influences, but then audiences. The data is incredible, and this is such a cool project. So first question, so clearly you show the story about sort of COP and like extroversion related to climate change, but I'm wondering, like, just on a personal level, who are the leaders or states that inspire this president? Like who would he love to emulate? Who would he like to surpass? Because I think that's interesting within the conversation. And then also just in terms of analysis of the speeches, you have such cool content analysis. And I'm wondering, like, thinking about these different domains in terms of whether they're valence issues, so issues that society largely agrees upon, and it's just a question of like, how do we get it done? Or if they're position issues where, some people are for, some people are against, and you're taking one side and you're trying to be persuasive. And then lastly, in terms of issue salience, like how much does the population, like if you look at public opinion polling before and after, it seems like you do really cool stuff in terms of his ability to influence or not, or his ability to respond to various segments of the population, what they care about. Everybody typically wants infrastructure, but yeah, you have such a cool, nuanced way to look at this. So thanks.
Thank you so much for all three presentations. I just have a short question for Claudia. I'm coming from a conflict resolution and conflict management view on things. And so when I saw the drop in the 90s, I thought it was because of what happened in Colombia and conflict kind of way of looking at things. And so I was wondering how these parks that you're talking about, are they a subject or an object in the conflict in Colombia? Are they a source for more conflict or maybe for resolution? Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, quickly, just to add also thank you for your presentations. And Claudia, I have an answer. Sorry, I'm sick. A question about, because you were talking about citizenships and how parks affected negatively or not the access to rights of populations also living in the parks. I was thinking, what about indigenous mobilization and communities, and how have the parks maybe enabled them to gain privileged access to these territories?
Right. Olivia, ready to go?
Okay, I'm not sure this is going to really respond effectively to your question, but I guess, I would say that, in the case of these movements, particularly in the Highlands, in the work that I was looking at as part of my doctorate, it's very clear that the struggle for democracy, and particularly coming out of the dictatorships, for these movements encompasses both human and non-human life. But that this kind of is where this perhaps connects with Monica's point yesterday, but this is a profoundly historical question, because this mobilization draws on histories of dispossession, on the transformation of land tenure out of colonial and then kind of national projects. And then it's the history of this resistance that sort of comes out later in the 20th century, when these movements are kind of articulating a politics of nature that draws out these consummate visions or relations with the other than human that are otherwise obscured in kind of Western understandings of what constitutes a political actor. I guess the problem is, and this is where it gets a bit difficult, especially when we move into these histories of growing colonization, and also in kind of 21st century, the context of sort of the transformation of the state and indigenous politics that is also highly extractive, is that this isn't necessarily incompatible with extractive visions of nature. So, thinking about, and that this is sort of ties into some discourses of resource sovereignty or of resource nationalism that are indigenized, but are nonetheless sometimes still extractive and require or rest on a commodification of nature, that then sort of forms this tension with how other parts of the indigenous movements are conceptualizing nature. So, for example, this came out, and a lot of people have looked at this, but in 2011 there was this big conflict over a national park, Titnis, in Bolivia. The state wanted to build a highway through to kind of support the kind of cocoa growing sector. This was resisted by lowland indigenous groups, but leveraged against lowland indigenous groups were highland indigenous settlers who were kind of mobilized to try and confront lowland mobilized indigenous groups. So then you see this splitting of the indigenous and peasant movement in Bolivia, and it's this extractive question that sort of keeps coming up time and time again that kind of calls into question these histories of mobilization around nature that kind of, I would argue, come out of the 20th century, but that, become more complicated in the 21st. So yeah, I'm not sure that really sort of answers your question about what is left outside of democracy, but I guess it's a sort of a competing idea about nature and its uses within indigenous societies that still is unsettled.
Okay, so briefly, thank you for your questions regarding conflict. I think one of the most important impacts that conflict had on national parks was changing governance. the national park system has been very strongly hit by violence, with many members of the many rangers and park directors killed. And so the pull has, or the move has been since the 80s, when things start getting really bad, of management moving away from parks. So in the early period, many parks didn't have rangers, or were not really built, but the ones that had few very strong, staunch rangers there. And now you go to national parks here in Bogota, it's this huge building full of people, and how many people do you have in the parks? Much less. And that void was filled in mainly by the guerrillas in very conflicting ways. The one that we know the most about is park or nature protection, which for very mixed reasons. I mean, we all know that the jungle was absolutely key for the guerrillas, but then there are also these very funny stories of like one commander in the Caribbean whose son goes to university and comes back and says, "Dad, what are you going to do? This jungle, can be chopped down." And so there are a lot of mixed stories. But the point here is, the governance is like the state diminishes its capacity of managing parks, and these other actors increase their capacity, and it changes. It changes through time. But since you asked about conflict resolution, then it also impacts the conflict of the people who are living in the park and who have these problems, and the opening of like the political arena with the talks also opens the arena for these people to talk to the state. And the parks, which is something that I tried to say in the presentation, inspire this new environmental legitimacy that many peasants are seeking. And what they want to do is to change like 100% their public image as nature destructors for becoming, nature protectors. But in the discussions with the parks, they run against the law. And here again, it's key to understand that this is not a national issue, but an international issue. What a park is, it's defined by the IUCN. So if Colombia was to decide, okay, you're fine, yes, you're right, you can live in the parks, then that would not be accepted internationally as a park, and we wouldn't have a park system. And that's diplomatically totally unacceptable. So it's a mess. And within the national park system, since the over 20 years ago, with a project called Parks and People, Parks with People, there was this idea of trying to make the parks more people friendly. It's gone. I mean, yeah, some things have been achieved, but the main thing is very hard, because there's a law, and a law that is hard to change. Now, indigenous people have in Latin America, but in Colombia in particular, have a particular standing with parks. Since the first well-developed national park law in 1977, indigenous people have the right to live within parks, unlike any other citizen. But with the idea that indigenous people, live in harmony with the environment. And so that becomes very problematic, because what is it acceptable for indigenous to do within their management? But they're in a very different legal situation than anybody else. And that creates a lot of tension in Colombia. So the people who lived in Tayrona National Park, the peasants were kicked out, but the indigenous people who never lived in Tayrona National Park are consulted about what should be happening in Tayrona National Park. So that creates problem. And there's also, of course, the problem of then who manages those lands, the indigenous people or the Park Service. Some of the parks have been created on demand of indigenous people who want to create another layer of protection. So again, it's very convoluted, and there's this constant tension between indigenous peoples and park managers of how to manage those lands.
Hey, thanks, Jamie. Very quickly, so yeah, clearly I'll look at the ideas you're giving me are really interesting. I haven't necessarily thought of that. And so on the role models, let's say, it's clear that in a country like Egypt, the role models, regional ones would be the Gulf countries, and especially like the UAE, with probably be a model, and the Dubai model is seen as something that comes often. Internationally, will probably be Russia and China. So he's clearly looking in that direction. And just for the topics, I need to look because there's probably in the Arab Barometer or other polls some issues about that. But in the article I read about Jordan, which was leveraging some similar data, it's a non-issue. Environmentalism is a non-issue in a lot of these countries, in Egypt notably. So it's not, probably here there would be something interesting to compare with issues such as, for instance, right now is the reforming the status of الإيجار القديم مش عارف the rent system, like we have a rent control system from that is maybe 80 years old, and it's going to be reformed, and it's going to have massive implication, and it's the big hot debate right now. I think subsidy reform similarly. But so yeah, it's interesting. It would be interesting to compare because no, clearly the environment is. Even I was talking with some of there's the environmental movement is nascent. It's really, even human rights movements consider that the environment is not. Although Egypt objectively in the IPCC reports and so on is considered one of the main countries that is going to very quickly, probably my city is usually used in the modelization as one of the first cities that will disappear. So because it's at the level of the sea, and so there is this mismatch of, yeah, but it's publicly, I don't know, it doesn't seem to be an issue. Yeah.
Still morning, right?
Still morning.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning, everyone. So welcome back to very exciting session. We've been having very engaging sessions since yesterday. And so this morning, again, we are going to be looking at a panel on mobilization in the education sector. And I'm privileged to have two presenters here, Rocio Fernandez from the Global Forum on Democracy and Development. She's going to be looking at mobilizing to care, education and labor struggles of minority communities in Colombia. And then secondly, we have Diana Rodriguez Gomez. Thank you, from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's going to be looking at what rests behind events, a critical analysis of attacks on education. But before I go on, I quickly want to just talk about the presenters in a few words. Rocio is she's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Osun Global Forum, based there at the University de los Andes, Colombia. She has a PhD in sociology of education from the University of Cambridge, where she specialized in education policy and teachers' work. She's a member of the Working Group on Education Policies and the Right to Education at the Latin American Council of Social Science. Education at Latin, and a founding member of the Latin American Research Collective in Education at Cambridge. She's an interdisciplinary researcher with a background in education policy and cultural studies. Her works and writings focus on the links between education, labor, social reproduction, and social movement. Rosie, you're welcome. And then we have Diana. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Education Policy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with affiliation in Latin America, Caribbean, and Iberian studies. And she the Chinex Latin Studies program. She has a regional focus on Latin America. I work as a regional focus on Latin America. And her scholarship explores translocal processes of state building and education policy making in context of shared, in context shaped by high levels of political violence. Her work has been published in the American Educational Research Journal, Comparative Educational Review, Ethnography and Education, International Migration Review, Globalization Societies and Education, and the Journal of Education in Emergencies. She had support by the Council of Anthropology and Education of the American Anthropological Association for her work, a Fulbright Fellowship, a Spencer National Academy of Education Postdoctoral Fellowship, and mostly a Villas Early Career Investigator Award. You're welcome. So, Rocio, your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Damilola, for that introduction. As you just said, sorry. So yeah, I'm an interdisciplinary researcher, and my research basically sits at the intersection between critical studies in education, labor studies, and social movements. And today, for this presentation, I will be sharing some of the preliminary findings of the research that I've been doing in the context of this fellowship. And as some of the fellows might know, this was started a bit late. So I'll be discussing the labor struggles of madres comunitarias in Colombia. Madres comunitarias are one of the largest workforce in childcare provision in Colombia. They are women, often from low-income and marginalized communities, who provide early childhood care and education to over 1.5 million children, which is roughly like a third of the country's population for early childhood. That means age between 6 months and 5 years old. So the work began in the late 70s as a community initiative developed in the context of the local development model of the Colombian state, and it was later fully absorbed by the state and institutionalized under the Colombian Institute of Family Welfare, the ICBF, in 1986. But despite being essential to the care and social reproductive infrastructure, their labor has been long undervalued, invisible, neglected, and it remains regulated through highly precarious arrangements. So for decades, they were not even recognized as formal workers, but rather as caregivers called to serve their communities. And it wasn't until 2014 that they gained access to a salary, so after 30 years of working, and not until 2016 that they won the right to a pension, and which is now still like not fully met. So their conflict centers on the demand for recognition, payment, the conditions of the kid with whom they work with, and the full labor rights, challenging a state that both relies on and values their work through gender discourses of love, vocation, maternal duty, and more recently to professionalization policies and discourses. So I frame this as a kind of strike that exposes particular labor regimes, and I disentangle some of these threads by looking at the dynamics of their labor struggles during the last decade. So here's like a very brief timeline since the beginning of the programs in the late 70s to one of the main protests and mobilization that was led by Sintra Sijovi, the National Union of Madres Comunitarias. And since then, a few other conflicts and labor struggles have continued evolving. So the question that I'm gonna try to address here is, what does the strike tell us about madres comunitarias labor regimes and its arrangements between productive and social reproductive spheres? So in this sense, by labor regime, I'm building on this category developed by Elena Baglioni, which is basically a theory and a tool or a method to understand the various ways in which labor exploits, manifests, and how basically labor exploitation occurs. And for this, I draw on debates on social reproduction and labor, which see this sphere as a central to labor regimes. Since although production is the fundamental side of value extraction, the labor regimes that enable such a process necessarily straddle other social spheres. In terms of the conceptual framework from which I'm approaching to this, is first of all the feminist lenses to social reproduction, lens to labor, so housework and other kinds of unpaid or non-fully recognized forms of labor are vital for productive tasks. However, capitalist societies tend to create this fictitious yet fundamental division of labor between workers who reproduce capital and those who reproduce labor power. So this differentiation between production and social reproduction in the formation it has been key in the formation and shaping of education and care labor types of work, at least in Latin America. So I argue that madres comunitarias labor struggles and labor regimes sit at the heart of this contradiction. So, so far, well, as I was saying, this is an ongoing project. I've conducted interviews with madres comunitarias who are part of the national union or local unions in different regions of Colombia, or departments, interviews with researchers that have addressed either this topic or that have approaches to early childhood and are coming from a policy side and so on. Also looking at audiovisual archives from Señal Memoria, a public repository from the late 70s to date, so basically to the beginnings of the program and to how these have unfolded recently. And looking also to policy documents such as the guidelines that regulate the labor of madres comunitarias. So I'm going to be talking about 4 main ideas that come that come as an outcome from this question of what is the strike telling us about how their labor regimes are built and how their labor is basically a precarious kind. First, how the strikes have made the labor visible. Second, authorization of love and free labor. Third, how this program went from a community initiative to the continuous building of a precarious workforce. And finally, the outcomes of the strikes in itself. So, first of all, the strike enabled the visibility and the recognition of madres comunitarias' labor process by the employers, so the state, and also the civil society, or at least into some extent. The strike of madres comunitarias are significant because they force visibility also in the public space onto a labor process that has long been naturalized, informalized, and very much invisible. For decades, the work was framed through discourses of maternal vocation and community service, and not as wage labor. So, in fact, the program was rolled out with an emphasis on giving the workers, in this case, the madres comunitarias, the opportunity to carry out an activity beyond their mere role as housewives or dueñas de casa. So the strike interrupts this narrative. It pushes the role into the public spheres, not just as caregivers, but as workers. And in doing so, it challenges the state to recognize them as an employer. It attempts to do that, at least. It also engaged some parts of the civil society that basically, before that, some of the different sectors had no idea what madres comunitarias were, what they were doing. They didn't know about the large workforce that they represented. And also, it allowed them to allocate the legal arrangements to the work. So they were, of course, they were experiencing this very precarious situation, but they were very much unsure on what were the legal mechanisms that allowed this and where they could find solutions or they could struggle against it. So also, and here I'm kind of paraphrasing this famous Silvia Federici quotes on, they call them love, but it's unpaid labor. And something that have appeared very clearly in the interviews is appeals to both. So it is love, it is care, and there is a strong notion of the extended family and of love as care as something that is intergenerational. That was and is still in the core of the program, or at least in the way in which they deploy their work. Also, it had longer a relationship with the territories at the beginning, when it was basically these local initiatives before the ICBF institutionalized the program, and that had strong local and situated leaderships among the women. Also, there's a lot of guilt in which the madres comunitarias deal with the situation of love. So they, either with their own families and their children, and with the reivindication of the labor rights. So in many of the interviews, they tend to justify the fact that they are actually struggling for their labor rights. So they will say yeah, we do love these kids, of course, but by the way, we would like to be paid, and that doesn't contradict the situation. So I think here there's a quote from one of the interviews that kind of shows this relation. So I was basically asking her, why does she think that there are still many madres comunitarias that are working in this, because given the fact that the conditions are so precarious. So she was saying, there are two reasons why we continue, and it's not because we have any guarantees. We don't have any kind of guarantee. There are two options, or rather two reasons. I'm on the one side, but I know there are others who are on the other side. So one is that there's nothing to do in Colombia, not much at all. And whatever there is, you take it. And the other is that you have to have a lot of love to do this. And I believe that because I know I could have done something else since I got there when I was very young. She actually started at the age of 18 working in this program. And I really could have done something else, but I fell in love with what I was doing, and that's why I'm still there. But many do it because they truly have no other option, and it shouldn't be like that. Children are not anyone's experiment. Children shouldn't be used to get rich, or children should simply be the hope and future of all of us. Okay, something that has also come as a response to the labor, to their strikes, is a kind of double movement, to paraphrase Polanyi's concept of double movement. So basically, the fact that they that they secure some of their labor rights in terms of getting the pension, in terms of being paid, this now has created another kind of demands. So the demand now is not necessarily about being paid. There's still an issue about that because they get very precarious labor contracts, not through the state, but through private foundations or associations. But now there's a demand about their mental health and their conditions of burnout in which they are. So basically, this demand of labor recognition have now entanglements with discourses of professionalization in the context of education, as well as something in which Colombian state and other kinds of state should invest much more to achieve some outcomes of development. And this is pretty much like shaping their laboring capacities and their caring capacities with the children they work with and with their own lives. So they usually will talk about this like large, tremendous amount of paperwork that have appeared in the last years as they have become more recognized through the state. So again, this is another quote that kind of exposes this. So she was telling me about these many documents that they have to fill and how she does it in her everyday work. So she says, there is a characterization form, which is for the children. Those characterization forms can be filled out unless we do the home visits, because they ask you things like how the child sleeps, in what position, how do they sleep, where the house is located, if it's on a slope, if it's steep. They ask everything. Then there's the enrollment form, which the foundations are supposed to provide in advance, but they don't. They shouldn't give us this beforehand. They should give us this beforehand, but instead they start with the whole back and forth about whether they're going to contract us or not, which foundation is coming or is not coming, and they drag that out of the 2 or 3 months, just stringing us along before hiring us. So basically, they will start working in February, but they won't get their contracts until April or a bit later, or they don't really know if they will be hired, because these foundations that are like the link between the state and the work constantly has a lot of faults with this. So, and then when they finally do come, they show up with a pile of paperwork that they just hand over all at once. So we have to take all of that home in order to meet all of the requirements they're asking for. Sometimes there are activities that require us to provide perfect evidence, beautiful, polished evidence, but they contribute very little. And it's up to us to do all the work. You end up working late into the night just to meet all their demands. So also like a lot of the madres comunitarias were telling me, or I was trying to ask them, right? If your labor is so precarious, if you start working so early in the morning, so other mothers and parents can go out to work, and then you also have your own family and your own things to do, how do you manage to fill all this paperwork? And there are different strategies, right? So for instance, some of them will pay someone else to do this. And their salary is the minimum wage, right? So if you're already having the minimum wage, and even so you find yourself in the need to hire someone that could help you with this, that's telling like a lot about how they are living their everyday life. Some others will just try to fit it in whatever time they have left, in detriment of other activities of their life. Okay. Also, there is a shift or a change in the role and how the madres comunitarias that are part of the union are seeing the national Sintas y Hobby Union. So even though this organization allowed them to negotiate with the government and with the state and to have this national kind of visibility to enter in those scales of negotiation, it has also created other kinds of discontent in the sense, especially after the 2016 major strike, in which they no longer feel very much represented by the union. They don't feel that they are grasping with the new and very much recent rearticulations of the labor force and the labor regimes, and which sometimes they will mention that, of course, Colombia is such a diverse country and the labor arrangements are built around your territory, and it really makes a difference in which the parents of the kids you take care of will work, what kind of sector they're doing, that kind of nuances are not fully able to be met or to be seen at the national union. And there's also, I don't have the data, but I would say that half of my interviewees have told me that they are either creating like local unions or they were already participating in local unions and are like moving from this national institution or union to a more local organization. Okay. How am I doing it? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So some concluding thoughts. So, madres comunitarias labor is central to the reproduction of social life and it supports the functioning of the broader Colombian society and economy. Also, these kind of labor regimes have resulted from the restructuration of both the educational sector and the labor sector, and the dynamics between both. So, for instance, in the recent years, there has been first this shift to measuring the potential increase in countries' GDPs from a standard test on literacy and numeracy to years of schooling. So if the countries are focusing more and more in years of schooling as something that will lead them to development or to increase their economy, this also manifests in the way in which early childhood population, and in this case, madres comunitarias, are being transformed. Also, well, basically, this kind of goes very much in line with the research on what they usually call care type of labor or social reproductive labors, in which these kind of workers find themselves constantly trapped in this labor precarious dynamics. So even though they will find some recognition into some extent, they like some other rearticulation will happen, and they will keep they will be trapped in this dynamic. Yeah. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Let's see if I can find one. ¿Está abierta? Okay, I can see like others. No. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you, Rocio, for inviting me, and thank you, Lola, for that generous introduction. So I'm really excited to talk about what rests behind events. The fact that I'm going to be talking to political scientists pushed me into new directions, so I'm excited about the conversation that we're about to have. So this piece is the last empirical chapter from the book that I'm currently working on. The title is Community Insurgency and the State, Education Governance in Armed Conflict. And actually what I'm trying to answer in this book, it's a pretty straightforward question. How is a public school governed in a zone controlled by guerrilla forces, right? I mean, we see the contradiction between a state and non-state actors just converging in a very specific institution. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to try to bring you all, my audience, to my world, education, and more specifically, education emergencies. And then I'm going to delve into the core of my argument. So why? Why do you do education? Well, what I'm doing in this book is I'm bringing literature from rebel governance and collective action in armed conflict. And when you delve into the literature, you realize that political scientists have been paying attention to specific institutions. You see taxation and security, self-defense and community groups, public goods provision. This is fascinating because you will find all these books just talking about social services and collapsing lots of very different things under that very broad category. And then for those who pay a little bit more attention to education, they will explain how insurgents will build schools to gain legitimacy, how they're going to use schools as military targets or as justifications for tax collection, or with Theo Valvez' recent books, schools become just the stages for the political theater. There's no one really looking at school dynamics. And then when you jump to collective action in armed conflict, the story, it's very similar. I highlighted here all the institutions that have been analyzed. The school so far has been overlooked as sites of rebel governance and collective action in armed conflict settings. So why? Why do we need to think about education? And in my case, why do we need to think about schools? The first argument is an argument about magnitude. I mean, this is a massive phenomena. I'm not going to talk about something that is exceptional or specific to the Colombian context. Here, you have some numbers to help you get sense of the scope of the phenomena. And of course, that also justifies why it's worth doing this research in Colombia. We know from Rutas del Conflicto that between 1990 and 2020, more than 300 school takeovers and attacks happened in the national territory. So the scope of the phenomena should push us to pay attention to schools, but it's also endurance. Even though we have data showing that right now schools in Mexico are closing related to drug violence, most of the schools remain open. They keep operating. And here you will find some of the literature that documents that. So they still open, but they not only stay open, they adapt to political violence. And you will see this not only in their pedagogical approaches, but also in very specific infrastructures. The Truth Commission in Colombia identified a school in Cauca where they built a bunker so they could protect students and teachers while armed combat was happening. So magnitude, endurance, adaptation, and the last one, this one you know about, is the tactical significance of schools. I mean, schools serve as military targets. They play a huge role. But besides that, we know that different insurgent groups around the world have invested resources, time, people into building educational systems and, of course, shaping the curriculum that is taught in the schools. So for these reasons, I think that we need to pay more focused attention on schools. So now I'm going to bring you to my field. Education is as massive as political science. So when you work in the School of Ed and you said that you work in education, that means nothing. You need to situate yourself into a more niche field. And this is my field. It's the field of education emergencies. It's pretty recent. It was I think it emerged in the 1990s, and it's a combination of humanitarian practice and scholarly work that analyzes what happens when crisis and education overlap. If you Google education emergencies, you're gonna find plenty of images similar to this one, where you can see that there's this sense of emptiness and paralyzing. I mean, there's no people, there's no human agency. It's just a very top-down approach to what violence does to people. And of course, because we're so focused on attacks, that also means that the field moves across crisis all the time, right? First was Syria, then it was Ukraine, now it's Palestine. It is an event-oriented field. And maybe because it's very recent, there's also been efforts to have very clear concepts. And I want to spend 30 seconds on how the field understands crisis. Crisis to people working in this field, and by that I mean humanitarian workers, but also academics, is a serious disruption that exceeds the ability of the affected community. And what I want to do today in this presentation is to problematize this idea of exceeding the capacity. When we draw from this definition, we're of course thinking about victims. Right? I mean, we're framing teachers, students, school administrators as victims of political violence. The field, I mean, the fact that it has that concept reflects in the way in which the field operates. And here I just brought you an example. This is a new data portal that shows you all attacks across the world, the school attacks. And yeah, I can't read from there. But it will give you the different categories of where the attacks are happening. And it gives you the sense that attacks are bounded, could fit into very specific categories, and are external to you. And I find that problematic. So what is it that I want to do now? I want to problematize how we're currently understanding attacks in education. And I'm obsessed with mechanisms and practices. And I want to understand how people engage in collective action when these disruptive events happen. To do that, I'm drawing from a pretty cool sociologist from the New School in New York, Wagner Pacifici. She analyzes the social making and events. And she explains how events are mobilized and constituted by speech acts or their performative equivalents that materially change the social and or political world, including the identities of the actors and institutions. So what would happen, and here's the experiment that I did, what would happen if instead of thinking about attacks in education as attacks, I will think of them as events, drawing from this notion. So she poses 4 questions, which I love how simple and straightforward they are, is what is this thing that is happening? Who's inside the event? What actions should or should not accompany this event? And the last one, am I or are we inside the event? I won't cover this. I wrote a paper on that, so I'm going to focus on the first 3 questions. The case, again, we're in Colombia. This time I'm going to take you to Eastern Colombia, to Arauca, which is an oil-rich area of the country where you will find not only inter-guerrilla war between the ELN, the FARC, and now the disidencias, but also, of course, presence of paramilitary forces, the National Army, and multinational corporations. So what's important to know is that many times when we talk about the armed conflict, we think only about the political violence, but the reason why guerrillas are so strong in Colombia is because they have an armed arm. That sounds very weird, but I think it's right. But they also have a political arm, right? They have a political arm that has been working with local communities. So you shouldn't be surprised if in areas impacted or areas controlled by guerrillas, you will find a rich organizational life. And that's important for the story that I'm going to tell you today. In Arauca, between 1997 and 2015, 22 schools were attacked. And the school where I conducted this research is one school in a 500 inhabitants hamlet that has half a dozen attached multi-grade schools. So it's dispersed across 2 municipalities. So data collection methods, I was able to fly to Arauca in 2017. There was an overlap between the FARC and the government peace dialogues and the ceasefire between the ELN and the state. So that opened access to territories that Colombians outside of those areas had never been before. That's why I was able to go to Arauca, where we conducted with research assistants over 70 interviews. And last summer, I was finally able to go back to Arauca. From the document analysis that I did, what I want to highlight is that the school was generous enough to give me full access to their email account. And to me, that changed the whole story that I'm able to tell today. So the argument, I mean, being aware that in humanitarian settings, this idea of attacks, lack of agency, has served as a justification for international intervention. What I'm trying to do here is to claim that attacks on education just seem to pause human agency and really limit what we understand about the sites where these events are happening. I think that by moving from attacks to events, we will be able to shed light on the collective action that happens in these settings. Okay, findings. I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time. Okay, so here's the news. It was, this is how it was reported on March 9th, 2015, a National Army patrol occupied the Rafael Baralt School Farm in Arauca, Colombia. It is one of the tiny dots here in this portal that documents school attacks. But then, when you open the email, this is what you start finding. So, this is a copy of the letter that the school principal sent to the ombudsman. If you pay attention, it wasn't drafted on March 9th, it was drafted on March 16th. Why? Because 4 soldiers got into the school asking the school principal to raise the Colombian flag, and she was offended. We need to remember that this school is located in an area controlled by the Domingo Laín Science Front. So what is she doing here in this letter? She's stating the actors who are involved, the school leaders, teachers, and parents. I highlighted them for you. And she's expressing that the school should be protected, that the school shouldn't be involved in war dynamics. And by trying to do a ceremony that honors the National Army, they will be putting the right to education in danger. Then, again, thanks to the emails, this is so inconvenient. I built this timeline that shows everything that happened in the 5 months after the army got into the school farms. And I listed all the different actors that they were able to pull into just organizing to expel the army. What's interesting to me in thinking about collective action, that you can see the wide range of strategies. So they sent official letters to the Catholic Church and state institutions across sectors, thinking here with Gupta and Ferguson in flattening the state. It didn't matter that they are in a completely isolated area in Eastern Colombia. They were reaching out directly to the vice presidents. So that for me, it's fascinating. Then they also established a humanitarian commission with public official and human rights to bear witness of the presence of the National Army. They sought support from local and national mass media. That's also why I was able to find news online. They canceled classes and they just informed the Department of Education that they were not opening the school because it was putting students at risk. And they blocked the highway in protest against the army's presence. And finally, they had security councils. When you put all these strategies in a historical perspective, you realize that people in Arauca have been mobilizing by these very same means since the 1970s. And that's related to the history of the ELN, of the Domingo Laín Science Front and in Arauca. So as we read those communications and we see the different strategies, we can see how events start organizing the identities of the different actors. And here you're going to find the school with its allies claiming that the army needs to leave if they want to protect the right to education. Then we're going to have the ELN in the middle. You will see why I'm putting it there. The governor, who was very skeptical, he even doubted that the army was there. And on the opposite side of the equation is going to be the national army. How are they going to position themselves? The key point of contention is going to be who's aligned with international humanitarian law, who's going to protect rights. And this is a testimony from a person working at an NGO that is linked to the Domingo Laín Science. What I highlighted here for you are all the actions, all the things that they were doing, but I also thought that it had a lot of value in paying attention of how they were framing the arguments. I'm going to read this. He's telling me what happened at this meeting where they invited the army. And this is the argument that he built against the soldiers. We told them, you cannot compare yourself to the groups you label as illegal. You're supposed to operate within the framework of the Constitution and the law. You're paid with our taxes. It is your duty to protect the people and uphold the law. So you can see how they're marking like very clear distinctions between the roles that different actors are playing, but also problematizing what the army is doing on the school grounds. Going deeper into that analysis, I thought really interesting to find that those organizations linked directly with the school through the Parents Association, the school board, the Community Action Board from this specific hamlet, are accusing the national army of violating the human rights and international humanitarian law. On the other side, we have the army saying our duty is to protect the Constitution. And by staying on the school grounds, actually what we're doing is protecting the civil society. We're not violating anyone by staying there. Of course, I don't want to romanticize collective action. And there's this point about a stigma. The school then had to suffer the fact that they were labeled as guerrilleros because they were denouncing the army. And here we have a quote from the same NGO employee saying, well, then the army was, the soldiers were asking, why are you reporting us and you don't report when the guerrilla is around? So just that tension between collective action and stigmatization. Against this idea of an attack that is something that just happens on a date, you can see how there's like a threshold. And here we have a quote from a student from 10th grade saying how tired, how sick she was of all this violence. First, only the army, but then the guerrillas were close by and there was always gunshots and bombs. We were always afraid to go to school because of that. On the radio stations, thinking about a stigma again, it was always said that the Rafael Baralt Educational Institution was this and that. And all I wanted was to go to class, at least I did, not with bombings and helicopters over there all the time. So you can see the struggle, I mean, her difficult position in wanting to attend the school but not being able because of what's going on. And what I appreciated about this quote is that she's telling you, she's giving us a sense of the temporality of this attack. Finally, believe it or not, it wasn't the army who withdrew, it was the ELN, thanks to the pressure from the Parents Association and all this rich organizational life. What's most interesting about it, that when I conducted the interviews and I asked school administrators, teachers, and students about this event, they didn't frame it as in the role as victims. They frame it as an opportunity. And please, don't think that I'm making a pro-neoliberal argument here, but I want to show you why. So this is from the principle. I was going to describe it that day as fateful, but I think that is the wrong word. We turn a problem into an opportunity. After the army's takeover of the school, these are all the changes that took shape in this specific institution. Through school-led initiatives, they implemented an adult learning program on Saturdays. They opened a radio station just here, and they also offer educational opportunities for FARC ex-combatants 3 hours away from the school. And then through all these deep connections with the state, all this exchange of letters that I alluded to, they connected the school even deeper with all the services provided by the Ministry of Education. Finally, to wrap up, implications. So what I'm suggesting that it could be productive for us to do is to move from attacks to events and challenge this idea of attacks as bounded or external entities. I mean, they're constructed. I mean, people work through them and make sense through them and make decisions based on them. I also think that we need to move from the idea of only victims. I think that there's right now in Colombia, because of the legal framework, there are some benefits, not a lot, in recognizing yourself as a victim. But I think in our scholarly analysis, we need to question what that category does to our analysis. And going back to that picture that I showed you early on, I think that we need to move from the idea of emptiness and desolation when political violence is happening and think more carefully about the organizational life that it's happening even though we don't see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rocio and Daniel. So questions, please. Yes. Let me pass.
Thank you for these very interesting papers. I have a couple questions for each of you. For Rosia, I don't know much about this particular sort of organization, unfortunately, so these are just kind of questions for clarification's sake. So apparently there's this institutionalization that happens in 1986. I was just curious, was that something that was sort of an initiative from the organization itself, or was that something coming more from the state trying to sort of bring the sort of group in, and then what were the implications of that? The second, especially dealing with the idea of the issues with the increased nationalization and sort of the feeling of distance, in terms of the union's internal dynamics, if a local unit is trying to strike, does it have to get the permission of the national unit to do so? I'm a Boilermaker, so we have to wait for the national guys to let us strike if something happens. I wasn't sure if that's the same situation here, or is there more autonomy for each of these sort of units at the local level? And then, Dan, just had a quick question. I wondered if you might be able to flesh out a little bit more on the theoretical notion of event that you're talking about with this. That, I mean, it's very interesting. I guess the one point that I kind of wonder about is, especially when dealing with violence, looking at it a little more broadly, getting away from victims and so forth towards agents makes sense. But does this run into kind of an existential problem when you're dealing with people who have actually been killed? Since, I mean, especially if it is being based on speech, few things stop a person from talking quite as much as stopping to breathe. So is this something where, in terms of which sort of agents or potential agents we're looking at, does that sort of bridge of death sometimes have to create some sort of differences? Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for these presentations. Diana, this is super interesting, and I love your emphasis on agency. I guess I'm thinking about this question in a totally different context, where schools are explicitly targeted to be closed. Like that's part of the mandate of the groups, and teachers are kidnapped. And there's definitely a negotiation in some areas, but that negotiation is more what are the educational opportunities that might be possible for the community, and it favors certain set of actors, those that could provide chronic education, for instance, instead of like state education that's associated with the secular government, right? So I just wanted you to speak a bit about sort of the scope conditions of how you view both sort of the intensity of tax versus insecurity versus school as a target, and then also like how this might be an opportunity for some constituencies, but then foreclose opportunities for other constituencies within broad schooling communities.
Any other question?
Thank you. Really enjoyed both of your presentations. Just a quick question for Jenna. How does this relate to all these experiences that we've seen in Colombia around zonas de paz and, you know, all the different attempts by communities in the midst of violence to kind of lay claim to the possibility of choosing its own path. And one of the tensions I see in what you're describing is, and if you could dig a bit deeper in that, is the closeness or association between the ELNs and the nature of the group being very socially embedded, etc., with the strategies in the school and the language and the discourse versus other cases across Colombia where maybe it's a different group involved, etc., where the community took much more of a neither with the government, neither with the armed group stance, because I feel like this is a slightly different example. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for your questions about the institutionalization of the program and the implications of it. That's actually one of the things that I'm looking at closely, and that I still, I don't know, would like to continue doing interviews with some policymakers. And we had this conversation with Diana about how rich it would be to have those debates. But there were many. I think the most important one is that this started, and that was something I didn't mention, as a more community-based initiative. That was, of course, developed in the context of the Colombian state approach to provide some fundings to these local, like juntas, to these local spaces, to do something. You know, like there's some money, do something in their community. But that gave them enough space and enough room to start kind of developing a project on what were their thoughts and their proposals in terms of care, education, health, how these dimensions should be developed in our community. And there was, especially from the archives, I've seen that there was this dialogue around the community that was not just limited to caring and education or nutrition, but also to how the parents could collaborate and how we can create like cooperatives to buy, for instance, food collaboratively. And that started disappearing as the state absorbed this program, right? So basically they will start being asked for more regulations. So they perform, it's not now all of them, but they were performing this work in their household. So that will mean that the state will ask them to have certain conditions, you know, okay, if you're going to take care of up to 12 children, then you need to have this sort of allocation in your home, and they will start asking for more, basically. Even though they were not getting paid, they were just giving like a bonus that it started like with something like $7 US back in the 80s, just to buy the food, just to to give them the money so they can buy the minimum things to prepare food for the children and to have these minimum resources to do. So yeah, that was one thing. This lack of this loss of a more collective knowledge making, and the increase in the regulations for their labor. About the links or the dynamic between the national union and the local union. So I'll say, well, something that happened as well throughout this program was institutionalized is that at the beginning there was this parents association figure that will regulate or that will work closely with madres comunitarias to perform this work. Then the foundations or private foundations were introduced. And now they are like the most prominent actor mediating this. So the state or the national union will be able to deal with the state. So for demands about pension, for demands about changing the legal decrees or creating, you know, some kind of law that will change that. But in the everyday aspects, are the local unions that are or that know about the foundations that are actually contracting them. And I think that that's the dynamic. So they can both call to strikes. That's what I've seen, or what they've told me. But the national union is the one that will push for more national-based demands, and the one that will call them for other kinds of manifestations. For instance, in March, they will call for the strike in support of Petro's government. And yeah. I think there was another question, no? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try to answer this in only one answer. I think all questions are somehow interconnected. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself so I can situate this answer. The doctorate that I really wanted to do was on violence. That's what I wanted to understand. And because of that, the field that was most obvious to me was anthropology of violence. And when you delved into that field, you realize that sometimes you will find a lot of pornography of violence, right? Like very explicit ethnographic accounts of what happens in genocide, combat, I mean, you name it. And I decided that that was part of the story, but that couldn't be the full story. And that's why I decided to try to think about what agency in this kind of settings look like. When you read What's an Event, that's the title of Wagner's Pacevici's book, she starts with 9/11, which is a pretty violent event. So it's not like she's neglecting violence, but she's saying, yes, violence, it's obvious, it's visible, but there's more to it. The event is not just the attack, it's what happens once the attack is over and how people make sense of it and how they use it for different purposes. In the case of the US and at a global level will be the war on terror. So what I think she's doing is just extending the scope of our analysis, and I find value in that. I agree. I mean, we know that political violence is a continuum, right? I mean, it can go from just I don't want to minimize it, but some drug dealers working around the school to schools being explicitly targeted by armed actors. In this case, there's some of the things that I made very explicit in this presentation are not explicit when you go to Arauca. Nobody will tell you that these 3 NGOs that I mentioned here are linked to the ELN. That's what you learn from talking to people and by reading the history of the region. So what you find in this particular municipality is a very strong presence of the Domingo Line Science, which, by the way, is the wealthiest and stronger ELN front. But because they're so invested in this region, the relationships that they build with the different local institutions are not necessarily coercive or violence. And this goes back to Ana Arjona's argument in Rebelocracy. I love your question about what peace meant to these people and how they engage in that. And the first piece of my answer will be methodological, because I conducted fieldwork in 2017 at the intersection of these two processes. People said a lot of things that they wouldn't usually say. They will open interviews saying, oh, no, I can't talk about this because this is over. Let me tell you everything that happened before. Of course, that changed in January 2017. The second round of interviews were thinner because the ceasefire was over. When you think about the school, right, what's unique about the school in terms of peace efforts, you will find like very specific pedagogical initiatives, some of them with a highly disciplining tone. They have disciplining tone, like they will have El Balón por la Paz, which was the ball for peace. And if you behave well, your classroom will get to play with the ball. Yes, I'm pointing at you, Francesco. Your classroom will be able to play with the ball for the week, right? I mean, there will be that kind of interpretations of peace, but they also work through conflict resolution in the school. They created a program, and some of the social studies teachers will be very explicit about the dynamics of armed conflict, why it happened in Colombia, and telling the history of the guerrilla. It was fascinating to me to see how teachers, instead of refraining from going to Arauca, they really wanted to go there because it was such a fascinating site. An extra effort from the school principal. I always told her that I wanted to be like her when I grow up. She's a fantastic, powerful woman. She created a training program from ex-combatants in the FARC. She never received any support from the Ministry of Education, but the ministry would travel one day just to show that effort who was done by the school. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it was like very piecemeal, led by a school, and because it is so fraught to make a claim about your identity with one of these left-wing groups, it wasn't an explicit effort. You will know if they use the term camarada, that person will be closer to the FARC, and if they use, compañero is with the FARC, and camarada with the ELN. So it will be through those terms that you will learn more about political affiliation than anything else. And I think I did it. See? Okay.
Is there any other question? Okay, thank you, Prof.
The question is for Diane about the role of the state, which is represented by the army in all of this. And what does it tell us about legitimacy and control? It doesn't seem, obviously, when one looks at from the outside, it does not seem unreasonable for the army to say, well, maybe you should fly the country's flag on this school, just like the country's flag flies on every other school in every country. So I'm wondering if there was a degree of understanding of what the army was trying to do, or if this is just not only the rejection of the army, but a rejection of the state as a whole. Yeah, exactly, by someone who works in a state institution. I don't know how many of you are, well, all of you are young, so you don't remember the Holy Cross dispute in Northern Ireland. But have a look at it if you want to kind of find out the stuff about legitimacy, the state, who represents whom. Just type Holy Cross dispute Belfast, and you will see it. And it's because when you were talking about this, that's what it reminded me of. The legitimacy of the state that is challenged by someone who works for the state.
Thank you for that question. And I think that's one of the questions that pushed me to think that this could be a book project. So when you talk to people, as it happens in many other regions of Colombia, you will ask about the state and they will say the state is not here. But then when you start paying attention, you realize that the state is there in a very oppressive form. And I don't want to build an argument about local people not knowing or being clueless about the reality. This is not a false consciousness kind of claim. It's about the invisibility in which the state is present here. Again, because I was able to see their email, I saw how the state played through different logics. The first one, I call it data for pesos. I will extract information from you every single week, and I will give you some money. So the state is present by funding the school. When you get to the hamlet, this is a autoconstruido, this is a self-constructed hamlet. I mean, every single house there was built by farmers. The only brick institution is the Christian church and the school. So data for pesos is the second one. The other one is subtraction. You will, when you read all these policy documents, you'll see they're going to change education in Colombia. They promise everything. And at this point, they were promising universal lunch programs and public school transportation. But then when you ask students about the food that they were just getting smaller portions from fewer ingredients and some of the things they weren't getting. So the state is constantly subtracting from all those big promises. And the third way in which I found the state is present is by preventing you from changing anything. And let me put it this way. Toilets. We never think about toilets, but in this school, they spent a lot of time thinking how to change toilets. This school was built during the settler colonial movement that Claudia talked about at the end of her presentation. And because it was built by the communities, they didn't have property over the predios, over the grounds. So when the state doesn't own the property, they cannot invest a single peso in transforming. So they fought for over 3-4 years to change the toilets, and it didn't matter what they did, it didn't work out. They were only able to change it when the oil company funded the initiative. So you will find the state in, that's how I saw it, in those two different ways, like really limiting life, what life could look like there. Now, going to your question, what would people think or how they will make sense of that? I have one quote from the principal saying, I am the state. Like Mélenchon in France claiming, see, l'État et moi, as though it was exactly the same. And she was aware of the plurality of the state. It's like, okay, with education, this is what we're trying to do here, but we don't want the army. Every time the army arrived, it was a threat to their security. So because the state is not a single thing, I wish I could give you like a straightforward answer, and I can't. But yeah, that's how I'm navigating that. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a round of applause for them. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.